Hey, how's it going? Okay, so I am for the position that we should allow option or people that have recently been convicted of a crime to join the military as an alternative to serving their sentence. I would start by saying that obviously I wouldn't extend this to anyone convicted of a crime. I think there would be certain cases where this would be applicable. Um, Generally non-violent crimes. I wouldn't allow somebody that had just murdered 8 people. If you serve 4 years in the Marines or the Coast Guard, we'll let you get through it. So this would be something that would be left to both the judge and the military's discretion to allow the prisoner to take this option, and it would always be optional, never mandatory. My main reasoning for allowing this position is first that I think the U.S. has a crisis with how many people we currently imprison and how we treat those prisoners. The U.S. has, I believe, the highest incarceration rate in the world. We're, about 2%, or 4.4% of the world's population, but we house 22% of the world's prisoners. Our incarceration rate is about a little over 700 per 100,000 people. In other words, that is almost 1% of our population. The next highest, I think, is Russia at about 600. And Russia is a country that where you can go to jail for not only opposing the political regime, but also for such things as handing out what they deem propaganda supporting LGBTQ rights. And so I don't think that's a country we want to be anywhere near in those statistics. But I also think that for so many offenses in the United States, when people enter the system, regardless of what the offense was, they come out the other end as a career criminal. I don't think that our justice system is built in a restorative sense. I think it's built in a retributive sense. And so we are putting people in jail with basically the expectation that they are now going to be a career criminal. They come out, they're unable to get a job. I'll go into that a little bit more later. But I think allowing people to serve in the military is going to, provide a better outcome for the country. They're going to be useful rather than just sitting in a cell. And B, I think it's going to be a much better outcome for them on a personal level. They're going to become a productive citizen, most likely. Obviously, I don't think this is going to have a 100% success rate, but I think it is going to have a net positive outcome.
Hey, can you hear me? All right, excellent. Your video is a little choppy on my end. I think that might be my internet, but I think I got most of it. This is my first debate on this website. So 3 minutes seems like not a lot of time. So I have some arguments. I'm not gonna have time to go through all of them. So hopefully if I just bring up one aspect of it now, we can maybe bring up another aspect of it later to discuss. But my main two contentions, for lack of a better word here, are that I think that the main thing we need to be asking in this debate is who benefits from this, right? Because if nobody benefits from this, there's no reason to do it. And I strongly think that not only does the military not benefit from this, but the people in question here, the prisoners, the would-be people serving, have nothing to gain from this. First, I want to respond to a couple of your points, then I'll see what I can get through on my end. You said that the U.S. has a crisis with the people we imprison. I think this is the worst possible way of responding. And there's a lot of detail I can go into, but basically here's the main problem, right? Right now we have more prison strikes than ever before. We have more prison guards striking than ever before. This is the most attention the UN has ever given the U.S. Prison system. You know, they're talking about how things like solitary confinement are unconstitutional and are torture and all of these things. Uniquely, the way you can make any possibility of change go away overnight is if the prison apologists get to make the argument, you don't have to be here. You're choosing to be here. you could have gone to the military instead, right? This is what we call a masking issue, right? Because now overnight, all of that momentum goes away because anything that's awful about prison, no one's forced to be here. So that goes away. The other thing that you mentioned was that we don't want to be following Russia's example. Well, again, I can go into more detail on this, but if you try to look into the precedents, and a big deal here, a big part of this will be the precedents, right? Because how does the details of this exactly work? How many years of prison are worth how many years of whatever? So we try to look into like, well, how have other countries have done this before? The only countries that have ever had battalions of prisoners are Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, Napoleonic France, communist Russia, and now with the Syrian civil war. So we'd be following their example by doing this rather than sticking to what we currently have. And then the third thing that you talked about is that this creates the status quo, so to speak, creates career criminals. There are already so many programs in place to address this. Why is it that none of the people, right, none of the people trying to reform career criminals are actively advocating for this? No one has thought of this idea as like putting people in the military. Well, as it happens, as I have some evidence I'll try to bring up later, the military doesn't see this as a useful tactic.
Yeah. Okay. So first of all, I think that I understand what you're trying to make of those countries that have implemented it before, not being the best examples that you would want to follow. But I don't think that just because a country or a specific government has done terrible things doesn't mean that they don't have anything that we can implement. For example, Nazi Germany, the Volkswagen or people's car, which is one of the very few good things that I would point out that that regime accomplished, making an affordable vehicle accessible to most of the country. But your main 2 points as to you don't think that it would benefit the military, and you don't think that it would benefit the inmates involved. I'm not sure that it would benefit specifically military strength or making us prouder, more robust of a military nation. I would kind of do it as more of a CCC project, under FDR, and that you're giving people jobs, which is going to help booster the economy. If these people committed crimes that have had an economic effect, or that they've got deaths, damages caused, you would be able to put a garnish on their wages, and instead of them being in prison where they're not going to, most likely, depending on the situation, really be able to make any money to pay back anything that they damaged. In the military, they would have a salary that you could garnish to pay back the court costs, to pay back anybody that was harmed, to pay back any damages. But I really do think that having a system of discipline, having a system where they're able to, they have an economic opportunity. I think a lot of the people that we would be talking about are people that grew up in low-income neighborhoods with no economic opportunities, likely a broken family, likely a broken education system. They really, if you look at the amount of young black men that are incarcerated for this country for low-stakes drug offenses, they really, in a lot of these cases, I think, haven't had any opportunities. They've been dealt a very raw hand. And after they come out of serving their first prison sentence, what are they going to do except continue, through what got them in prison in the first place? Because now they're in the exact same situation, except they have more connections that are criminals, and they are less likely to find a job now that they have a prison sentence on their record, as opposed to coming back 4 years later, with a whatever skills they learned in the military, and having that, I think they're more likely to get a job. I would say they're better off.
Oh, it's my turn to speak. I was waiting. Yeah, so I think you bring up a really good point, and I agree here that like these people who are uniquely underprivileged in the way the world is right now are the people who we should be trying to help right now. I completely agree, and I have arguments to address this. I'd like to first focus on the military issue, because you address it a little bit, right? So you say that it's not necessarily giving the military strength, but it gives people jobs, kind of got an FDR thing going on. But let's really look at this, right? Here's why it doesn't benefit the military. The first thing is that it's against military policy. There's 2 points under this. First of all, the military doesn't take people with felonies unless they have a waiver signed. And if you want to get any significant effect from this sort of policy, you need to get a lot of waivers signed. That's a lot of clog and a lot of work. But let's say hypothetically you do it. There's specific rules in the Navy, the Army, the Air Force, and the Coast Guard that says if anyone is forced to enlist as a punishment in a court of law, they're not eligible. So we're talking hypotheticals here. Would it be good? Would it be bad? Right? But these military branches have gone out of their way to prevent this sort of thing from happening. Why? Let's go into the reasoning. First, the U.S. Military Academy published a paper called Citizen Responsibility and National Defense. And they say, by forcing citizens to serve, we significantly reduce the effectiveness of our armed forces. The effectiveness of our military units is a vital element in our nation's status as a top military in the world. If citizens were forced to enter the military, there will inevitably conflicts amongst those who volunteered and those who were forced to give their services, right? So they don't think this is a good aspect, because our ability to work with our troops is a huge part of how the military functions at all. You have a handful of people who don't want to be there, that compromises everything. So it's not just something that maybe isn't helpful. It's something that's actively detrimental to our ability to function as a military. On top of that, you have the issues of it becoming irrelevant because the military is moving towards automation. One, troops are our biggest expense in the military, right? Like housing them, feeding them, equipping them, healthcare, transportation, sanitation. That is most of where our military budget goes. So the more people we send in unnecessarily, the less stuff we can do. And secondly, drones and technology are just more efficient. They're cheaper, they're more effective at getting targets, and they make it lower maintenance for us to have a military presence somewhere. Instead of having a base with hundreds and hundreds of people, you can have a much smaller presence while still maintaining that area. So the military has no interest in doing this. It actively hurts their ability to do this. Now, the issue of whether it's individually helpful to the prisoners, we can get into, but I just wonder if you have a specific response to anything regarding the military.
Yeah, I'll try and start back at the beginning. So the specific codes in the military that prevent this and require waivers, I think if you implemented a nationwide system like this, that would necessarily go hand in hand with changing military codes to, allow it. And maybe something as simple as, if this goes down as a court punishment, you don't need the specific waiver that you would need if it was just a felon applying separately. I agree that forcing somebody to be in the military probably makes them a less effective member of the military. There's a distinction here between, forcing them and giving them the option. I think there's a fair argument that you might make to say, is it really that much of an option given that the alternative is prison? Which is fair, but I do think there, having the option is a big difference from simply saying you have to go. But at the end of the day, the military, our military, and pretty much most militaries throughout history have relied on forcing people, at least in the past and at least in times of war. Many militaries throughout the world today still have a draft, still have mandatory service. I believe Israel, Germany, some of those countries allow different options instead of going into the military. I'd like to focus on the fact that when we think of the military, we think of the Army, Air Force, Marines, Navy generally, but there's also the National Guard, the Coast Guard. There are branches of the military which serve a lot more in a civilian capacity. We might think of them doing things that are less traditional military focus, and more. For example, with the hurricanes we just saw. Going into natural disasters and helping clean up, helping people. I think there is a lot of work that we can put these people to do that might not be, carrying a rifle and going to shoot. And I do agree that the military is turning more towards automation. But I don't think we're ever going to replace boots on the ground. And in fact, when it comes to specific things like peacekeeping missions, if you look at the way that policing in the United States has gone, from beat cops walking the streets, knowing the neighborhood, knowing the people, having relations, I think it's gotten a lot less effective the more technologically advanced we've gotten. When you put people in cars, studies show, put cops in cars, studies show they stop getting to know people in the neighborhood. They lose those relations, and as a result, they stop being officer so-and-so. It's just, the police. We lose those connections. They're a lot less effective. So I think having more boots on the, so to say, more people will be more effective.
Yeah. So on your point about us, there's a distinction you say about between forcing people to do something and giving them the option. Well, this is why organ sales, for example, are illegal, right? There's a massive demand for people needing organs, and everybody has these organs that you don't need both of, for example, that you can sell them. Why is it illegal for us to solve this problem and get someone money? Because it forces people who have less money and less means to make dehumanizing decisions, right? It forces people who are hungry or need to feed their kids to sell their kidneys, right? It's unfair for a society to force that onto the psyche of people just because we didn't give them the same opportunities, just because they're poor, just because they're minorities, stuff like that. That's why we avoid things like that. Next, you say, well, we need to give people the option. That's good in itself, but you don't really give everybody the option, right? The military has physical service requirements that you need to be able to meet. So if you have disabilities and you go to prison, well, you don't get the option of doing this. You have to go to prison. So that's part of the reason it's already not legal, right? It's inherently discriminatory, not only based on who gets the option, but also you say yourself, like, Black men get convicted at way higher rates. People who can't afford better lawyers get worse deals. People who can't afford fines have to trade off with prison time, right? This uniquely affects people who are underprivileged, and it would be fine if it was like a summer camp that they could go to and get the stuff that they need. I work at a summer camp every summer. I'm happy to help with that stuff. But the fact of the matter is that it's not. The historical precedence of prisoner battalions is basically human mind detectors. You march them out. It doesn't matter if they live or die. That's the way these people are treated. Secondly, the last example you talked about, you said in times of war, sometimes we've had a draft. There's a really good reason we haven't had a draft since the Vietnam War, because people went there, they didn't want to be there. They started committing horrific atrocities, burning villages, raping people, killing children, right? That's why we don't do that stuff anymore. And 31% of the people we sent to Vietnam came back with PTSD, right? That's what we're inflicting on these people. And you can say, right, well, maybe they'll go into the Coast Guard, but one, there's no way of guaranteeing that. But two, there's so many other programs. Why would we do this? It's inherently forcing them to make a decision that human beings shouldn't have to make, where it's, well, do I go to prison and get stabbed or raped in prison, or do I go kill people in the Middle East, right? Like, that isn't how we should be trying to address the problem that you brought up, which is that prisons have these issues we should deal with. And on that point, it's further masks it, right? Because at no point in this whole thing have we ever addressed the issue of what happens when we take the focus away from how to fix prisons. What happens when the people in charge of these prisons get to just shrug and say, well, nobody has to be here, right? I think that is a key aspect of this debate.
I'll talk about your point about masking. I see the point that you're trying, and I think I understand it. But I think that in turn is kind of a way of deflecting, and I don't think the argument that saying, well, if we do this, people will say, we've done enough, or we don't need to fix it now, is a good enough argument to stop doing something that might be helpful. And on the same lines, I think I do agree, it is going to be discriminatory to people that don't have the physical qualifications to serve in the military. There's a way I think you could get around that that I will try and talk about in just a second. But I don't think that, if we say we have, 100 applicants here, 8 of them are not fit for military service based on physical disqualifications. Me, for example, if I've broken 2 collarbones, I think if I break it one more time, I would be disqualified. There's a lot of people that would be disqualified from military service. I don't think just because you say, well, it would discriminate against those 8, if you think it would be helpful to the other 92, I don't think that's a good reason not to do it. I do think you could possibly make a system where either they get to choose what branch of the military they enter, or even creating a new or ending, the National Guard, or creating a new branch with a similar mission that isn't combat focused. That doesn't, I agree that you shouldn't force people to make a decision of, do you want to go to prison or do you want to go kill people? I 100% agree with you on that. But I think there are branches of the military where that's not going to be in your retinue, and B, if there's not room enough in that military service, I think you can expand it. We're paying a lot of money to house prisoners anyways. I think I'd be very okay with even doubling the amount of money we spend per prisoner, guarantee them a better outcome, or at least a good chance of a better outcome, so that we don't have to pay again when they come back in 2 years. I think right now it's after a year, over 50% end up back in prison. After 5 years, it's over 75%. I do agree there's a lot more that we need to do. This isn't a one size fits all solution. And then just quickly on I don't think that draft is specifically to blame for the atrocities that occurred in Vietnam, given that we have seen atrocities that have occurred in Iraq and Afghanistan, Abu Ghraib, for example, with an all-volunteer army.
Well, yeah, so sort of going backward there, right? We've seen atrocities happen in Afghanistan and Iraq. Why would we want more people there, right? We have military bases in Japan, for example, where a lot of people in Okinawa are complaining that, the people in the base, they get drunk, go into town and rape women. Why would we want to say now, sex offenders, nonviolent sex offenders can be on this base? How do we justify our presence there at that point? And then you also talk about how recidivism is high, but there's actually nothing to suggest that the military would uniquely decrease likeliness of people committing crime, right? Aside from the generalities that you talk about, of these people aren't getting attention, they're not getting disciplined, but there's so many things in prison that already do that. Why compromise our military strength, right? We have a finite military budget, and we'd want to get as much use out of it as possible. The more troops we have, regardless of where we have them, regardless if it's Coast Guard or National Guard, they need to be housed, they need to be fed, they need to be equipped. That's why the military is moving away from that stuff, moving towards automation. Why would we increase the number of troops we have at the same time we're trying to automate things? It just isn't in line with the military's priorities. You say that these people can be in non-combat focused roles, but then why would anyone ever be in a combat focused role? But also just generally, I think this option is always available to these people. These people can join the military at any point in their lives that they want, right? Nobody's arrested on their way to the recruiting station, and they're like, oh, thank God that you offered this now, because that's what I was going to do anyway, right? So prison already has things that help them reform. If they want to join the military before they commit the crime, they can. But we just know that it's not helpful to these people all in all. Why is it not helpful to these people? Because prisons have all sorts of issues, right? You talk about, you give the option to 92 people, right? But every person who doesn't go to the military, which has its own problems that we've talked about, but everyone who stays in that prison now has to stay in a prison where people get stabbed, or people get raped, where people get put in solitary confinement, which has been defined as torture, right? And none of these things get addressed. You say that I'm deflecting the issue. What I'm saying is, given that there's so many barriers to somebody actually enlisting in the military, right? There's the legal barriers. You say maybe they can fix it, but they're there. The precedence is there. The policies are there to stop this. There's the physical barriers of who can do this. And everyone who doesn't cross those physical barriers get put into a prison where all of these problems I'm telling you are being addressed right now, right? Right now we have the highest strike rates ever. Right now we have the most guards ever saying we're going to fix this problem. Right now is a worse time to do this because it seems like a Band-Aid to the problem, but it really isn't fixing it. And everyone who doesn't end up in the military ends up in a prison system that is doomed to never improve.
Well, I don't think that just because we are fixing the problem doesn't mean that we shouldn't do something else that might also help. I do understand your argument again. I just don't think that's enough argument to prevent us from doing it. And you do bring up that as far as discipline goes, that you don't think we would see lower crime rates from these people after they leave the military than after they leave jail. I think if you look at crime rates of military veterans, I haven't looked those up. I have no idea what those are. But I would be shocked if they were as high as they are of former felons. When you brought up sex offenders on Okinawa, nonviolent sex offenders, I didn't address that specifically. That would be one of the categories of people that I would not think would be eligible for this, just to make that clear. But I don't know. I do think that the military's training is built in a way that is built to improve you as a person in some ways, in a way that the prison system is not. And you talk about the improvements, but I think we've tried, there have been various attempts to improve prison conditions. I'm not saying it's not possible. There are countries that do it very well. I don't know if that is something we will be able to fix in the near future at all, just because there are so many complex problems. The prison industrial complex is such a major, huge part of the U.S. Again, it's almost a percent of our population that is in prison. This is such a huge thing. Whereas a policy change that would allow this, we already have the military infrastructure to allow people to go into. As time it would take to reform the entire prison system. I think maybe this is a Band-Aid, but if hey, we're working on fixing that cut on your arm, don't put a Band-Aid on it because we want to remember that it's there. We want to be able to see it. I'd say, okay, but until we're really ready to fix it, let's put a Band-Aid on it. Until I understand the argument that you think it's going to deflect from the issue. And I think that requires people to stay vigilant, stay working. I don't think the people that are currently pushing for all these reforms are going to give up just because of this Band-Aid, as you call it. And people might use it as an argument against improving conditions, but I don't think that would make much of a difference. That's about what I have to say. It's been a pleasure debating you. You brought up a lot of great points.
Yeah, it was a great debate. It is. But I just want to wrap up some points, right? So you talk about how crime rates for military personnel are lower than people. But yeah, but as we talked about, right now there aren't cons in the military, right? We don't have convicts serving, and we know that the recidivism rate is higher for these people. So we have no way of comparing the rates now with what it'll be after. For all we know, people who have been institutionalized or raised or under certain circumstances are just more likely to commit crimes. We don't actually have any tangible stuff that tells us the military will do this, other than the generalities of, well, the military is good for discipline, but so many other things already in the prison system are good for discipline. The problems with the prison system aren't that, people aren't getting taught order and responsibility. The problem is people are getting stabbed in the showers and have to endure torture as a practical part of the system. So you talked about how this, well, okay. The general point I want to finish with is we've talked about how it's not that the military hasn't thought of this, right? They've thought of this and they actively are against it. The military academy says that it's not a useful thing. Every branch of the military I could find has a policy against it, right? So if the military needed help, I doubt that you and I would be able to think of an option that they hadn't considered. Secondly, there's a lot of people in these, they're not hiding. The people who are advocating for better prison conditions are very vocal. They have a list of demands. I told you there's all sorts of strike movements. None of these people are asking to be put into the military, right? So why wouldn't we take their word for it? Why would we presume that we have some better solution to their problems? And, when we're talking about giving these people the option of going to the military just as a way of improving their lives, who's more targeted by military recruiters and military advertisement than low-income young males, right? They're already the prime demographic. They're already advertised more to than anyone. We have to believe that if they're not going to the military, they probably don't want to. And maybe they'll go if they don't want to go to prison more than they don't want to be in the military, but we both agree that that's inhumane to force someone to do. And I guess when we talk about it, I think there's no one who really benefits from this, right? The military doesn't stand anything to gain. They only stand to lose things. They only stand to lose efficacy. They only stand to lose money. Best case scenario, they lose less money, right? But they never benefit from this. People more likely to get PTSD. And like we talked about, like it's not, you're saying we put the Band-Aid on, we're going to fix this later. I'm saying the Band-Aid gets put on and people say it's fixed, right? Because they can always say, you don't have to be here, so we don't have to fix it. If you don't want to be here, join the military. But thank you so much for a great debate. It's